The theme of today's panel is, of course, very broad. And being Swiss, I wanted to make sure I defend our reputation and I stick to the time. So it's going to be broad, but I won't go as much in depth as I would have liked to. But my understanding is that you're going to get the presentation. So there's a lot of information that can be very helpful. I will touch on the issue of growth, but then I thought that what would be very interesting for you is also to see what the IDB can do, and specifically also the lesser known part, which is our private sector window. So there's a lot of details, but I'll just point out which are the major points. And I should also point out there are experts here that work in this field, so in case you would have any questions. So where are we now? I think many people in this room share my feeling of cautious optimism that Jamaica is finally leaving a recession that has been very long. Over the last 6 years, basically 5 years, was a contraction. And at the same time, there were 2 times when the country was extremely vulnerable and we were close to a crisis. However, we just heard before, the projections are that we're going to grow. We have the EFF, which has been the focus, or the stabilization has been the focus for everyone here for at least the last year. But I think it's now becoming something that's just a reality that we accept, but the focus is finally changing to what we really want, which is economic growth. We heard the impressive government agenda of what they want to do, and we know about it. We know from the press, we know what different groups are doing. And then, of course, there are specific projects, one of them, which is, of course, the content of this event. So basically, the basis for economic growth in Jamaica, as far as I see it, is confidence should increase, should improve with one review after the other completed with success under the EFF, because it is extremely important that people get some confidence that a crisis will not happen again, will not occur in the medium to long term. At the same time, we know there are all these economic and structural reforms which will basically help the business climate. My feeling is, however, that just from this basis, growth will be slow and tedious, simply because it is based on gradual improvements in business climate, gradual improvements in confidence, and it relies on comparative advantages. But I think, especially also because of the length of the downturn, right now, marketable comparative advantages that are not being exploited already now, they are probably hard to find right now. So there's not really a driver of economic growth in Jamaica, and at the same time, we know there are disadvantages, comparative disadvantages of Jamaica. We know that the business climate is challenging. We just heard it also before. There are a lot of restrictions to growth. We know about low productivity. There's one study where I used enterprise survey, and looking at it, what surprised me is not that there are factors that constrain, or the companies say they constrain their growth, but it's that there are many. So what we found is that out of the 15 factors that they were asked about, 30% of companies said 7 factors were a major severe constraint. So it's not that you just have a problem, let's say, with the tax system or with crime, but the problem is there are many problems that bother companies, which can make it very hard here to prosper. We know that this also affects the most vulnerable in the economy. We know that the poverty rate has been increasing, even though we don't know the current number. There was a peak in unemployment, even though I know that it came down a bit. We are well aware of crime. We know that informal activity is rampant in Jamaica. And there's probably one bright spot, that is that remittances, which has served the country as a social safety net, or you could also say one of the export products of Jamaica, as George has indicated, is actually brains, it's persons. So remittances is recovering. However, as I mentioned, I want to talk more about the opportunities. So just quickly, how do we see the logistics hub? Without, of course, our knowing in detail what it will entail. But I mentioned before, the major driver in the Jamaican economy is still absent, and I think it will be extremely important because we have been in a very long recession, so there's some lethargy, there's some pessimism, and it's just hard to return to business as normal and be optimistic and move forward. I also think it's important if we talk about all these reforms that are happening, that you have something where the reform, that can give the reform some structure. I think it's very different if you do a reform and then you hope someone picks up the opportunity than if you have a reform, let's say the new business registration, the super form, you can create the firm and you have the logistics hub, which offers a lot of opportunities. It's very different. It's also different how it then probably goes back to the reforms because it gives an incentive to accelerate reforms. There are, of course, direct benefits from the logistics hub, which you know much more about it than me, so I won't talk too long about it. Just to mention, of course, we hope that it's not only the transshipment hub or the logistics hub, but what we hope is, of course, that there's some production here, something in intermediate manufacturing, especially also because this could lead to FDIs of the type that is not just capital, but is actually knowledge. There's something new coming to the country. We could learn something from it that can have extremely beneficial long-term effects. We all know that there are risks, and I think the existence of this two-day symposium is part that we acknowledge that it's an extremely complicated undertaking that we are doing. We know that there's competition from other countries, and the destruction I just wanted to mention, it's also important because this can become such an important program, such an important driver for Jamaica, that it is important not to lose sight of all the other parts that need to be done in the country. Otherwise, 20 years from now, we would have another problem, let's say, if we don't look properly at health. So if it's very successful, it will be important to not neglect the less successful areas. Coming to the role of the IDB, I guess this is the well-known role, which is the business that we do directly with the government. And as was mentioned before, the big problem here is that the same fiscal constraint that the government has, we're going to have too, because everything that we support goes through the budget. So there's a constraint there. And then the other part is, of course, that the government has a lot of competing priorities. So however, the lesser known part, or at least the lesser understood part, is our private sector windows, which I'm going to talk about in the rest of the presentation. Again, I try not to get lost in details, but I wanted to have all the information there, and I'll just point out what I think is important. If you look here from the Multilateral Investment Fund, going down to the Inter-American Investment Corporation, IIC, to the Structured and Corporate Finance Department, there are important differences, but there's also an overlap. But one major difference is that if you go down, the amounts become bigger. So the MIF would be the smallest, and the SCF would be the largest. They do similar things. There can be technical assistance, meaning grants for knowledge creation, and then one way or another financial support. So starting with the MIF, you could say the MIF is the laboratory. It's small, so we can be creative, we can take risks. And the idea is basically, if you find something new, exciting in the MIF, then you would go to the other two to get funding, or outside, of course, or outside the IDB. What the MIF tries to do, focusing on very small companies, even on micro enterprises, to level the access playing field through access to finance, access to market, and access to basic services. In relation to the logistic hub, one important part of the MIF is the regional PPP advisory service. So if you're considering working on a PPP, you should consider also talking to the MIF, because there's support from the MIF, even in terms of funding for feasibility studies. But the MIF together with the DBJ would be the organizations you would want to talk to. And then, as I mentioned before, it's a creative organization, so there can even be customized support for companies. Let's say you need to improve part of your process to access a specific, to supply a specific company related to logistic hub. The MIF maybe could help you. However, if you need funding, and as I mentioned before, now the funding becomes bigger. It would the IIC, and just the highlight would be what we're looking for is for small, medium enterprises that have a big growth potential and very important for the IDB to have a development impact. So it has to have this special part. We wouldn't just finance everything. There always needs to be an involvement, but still a fair share. And I wrote here that it's businesses, it's loans up to $5 million is the typical. In theory, it can go bigger, but it's rare to find bigger ones from the IIC. And the instruments we see, what we offer is a relatively broad range. It can be from grants to help the business with developing something new to different types of financing. And the financing can go from $100,000 to, in theory, $40 million. So it really covers a broad range. The requirements, without reading them all, like what we're looking for is viable, high growth businesses, and they should have a development impact, basically. And no adverse effects on the countries in terms of course, of environment, labor regulation. These things are very important for us as an organization. So stepping it up, there are some overlaps, but the important part is this one is now much bigger. Still, for even the SCF, we would want to have a development impact. Something needs to be special, like engagement of small, medium enterprises or job creation. Again, it needs to be environmentally sustainable. We want to have an involvement of the company. It wouldn't be 100%. One advantage of this one is the terms. We can go long term, from 10 to 18 years. It needs to be a secure business, so we want to have a completion guarantee, because these are now bigger projects, so we want to actually have a guarantee that someone guarantees this is going to be constructed. And similarly, we want to have a financial completion guarantee here, meaning that you can show that you have contracts, sales contracts, that this is a viable business. And again, we're relatively broad. And an important part to see is also they can be relatively sizable, from 10 to 200 million. If you add the equity that you would have to provide, then we could even syndicate further loans. This can be quite sizable projects. Talking about requirements, again, it's a viable, secure business with a development impact. You can see we have quite a lot of requirements because it's big size, and we're going to do our due diligence. That can be tedious, but on the other hand, there are actually organizations that like if you do business with the SCF because they know it's going to be an environmentally, socially, and financially sustainable project. So that can even be an advantage. Okay, let me conclude. We see this as a huge opportunity for Jamaica, and as probably everyone here in the room, we are very excited of what could come out here. The alternative to not having this project go through and not having these benefits is that we're probably going to see what we have seen the last 30 years, or we even think it could be less, because the old business model is probably getting less and less beneficial for the countries. The government, and as such also the sovereign guaranteed part of the IDB, is restricted by the fiscal space and competing priorities. However, we expect there are a lot of business opportunities coming up, and we would certainly be very interested in talking to companies involved in this and see whether we can find ways to support it. Thank you very much. Sorry, just a lot. Just to point out, the last two are the specialists for the MIF and the CCF.